next we turn our attention to Jeffrey as an ecumenist. And for that task, we've asked a dear friend of ours, Professor William Rush, professor of Lutheran theology at Yale Divinity School, someone who himself has been intimately involved in the ecumenical movement, Faith and Order, and in his own church. So we present Professor Rush.
Well, thank you very much. You've graciously invited me to come to this event, whose theme is the heritage of Jeffrey Wainwright, liturgist, theologian, and ecumenist. And I'm going to address this topic more specifically in terms of Jeffrey Wainwright, a theological and ecumenical nexus. And these remarks are based on some personal observations that I have made over the years. At the outset of these brief remarks, I want to make two comments. First, I want to commend those who put this program together, and that's certainly Michael and Jim, and I thank you for doing this. If I'm omitting some other people, I'm sorry, but I do happen to know that you both are guilty for this afternoon. And secondly, I want to, in the course of this presentation, offer a theory as why this invitation was extended to me to cross the Atlantic in the midst of an academic term, and why I accepted. But first, to the initial approbation. It's always appropriate, and indeed it's almost universal, to note and honor distinguished persons. Educational institutions do it, governments do it, social clubs and organizations do it, and even churches as institutions do it. And so it would be superfluous to give specific examples. However, it is especially fitting to do in this context. If the ecumenical movement is a multidimensional movement whose center is the task and gift of the visible unity of the Church of Jesus Christ, as I've argued elsewhere and will not repeat here, then this movement does indeed move because of several factors. And these are often enumerated. They include the insights of the liturgical movement, new understandings of the biblical message, new historical research, new appreciation of the nature and function of theological language. And yet, involved in all of these aspects, there's another factor that's often overlooked. The ecumenical movement succeeds where it does, and it's had its failures, because behind all of those aspects of theology and scholarship that I've just indicated, behind them are individuals. It is the commitment and mutual trust of individuals that enliven that learned achievement and make it possible to challenge the churches to receive, in the technical sense of that term, the results of the ecumenical movement and to change their practices and relationships, and even at times, their theology. I would argue if this is not unique to the ecumenical movement, it is certainly unusual to it. Many advances in human endeavors can be quite independent of the commitment and mutual trust of individuals. But such progress in ecumenical relations rarely occur when they are absent. The likelihood of such breakthroughs increases exponentially when those characteristics of personal appreciation are presented. Considerable ecumenical progress in the last third of the 20th century and the early years of the 21st century took place in part because of the presence and activity of one Jeffrey Wainwright. He was not alone in that era, but he was a major figure among giants. Jeffrey trusted, respected, and bonded with his colleagues in the ecumenical movement. And conversely, those features moved in both directions. If that contention needs any documentation, I would suggest anyone listen to the accolades about Jeffrey that were read on the occasion of his final lecture at Duke Divinity School, on the threshold of his retirement from the Cushman Chair of Christian Theology. There is a choir of non-Methodist voices that raises in praise of Jeffrey and his many contributions to the ecumenical movement. This kind of relationship, reflected in those words of praise and approbation, transcend denominational labels. This is often for individuals not engaged in ecumenical dialogues to understand. And just a side comment here, this phenomenon can contribute to the difficulties of the reception of ecumenical dialogue. People who have not been involved in that process and understand the development of personal trust, and I could even say love. So how can a British Methodist who exhibited no hesitation about being ecumenical feel closer to a Roman Catholic or a Lutheran than to some other Methodists? There's an ecumenical answer to that question. While Jeffrey favored organic unity as the model for the unity of the church, and on at least several occasions registered his discomfort with the Lutheran proposal of reconciled diversity, which he did in my presence more than once. But Jeffrey also acknowledged that there is a diversity that's a genuine part of the tradition of the church, and both tradition and church are capitalized in that comment. Now, because of this personal feature of the ecumenical movement, there is a special suitability in honoring one of the, in quote, saints of the ecumenical movement, as we are doing today. And there's no question about including Jeffrey in that list. One of his gifts, and by no means his only gift, was that Jeffrey combined in one person both ecumenist and theologian. What I intend by ecumenist is a person of deep commitment to the visible unity of the Church of Jesus Christ. She or he takes with uttermost seriousness the biblical imperative and indicative about the unity of the church. What I mean, respectively, by those two terms are that the essential unity of the church must be lived and made visible, and that the essential unity of the church presupposes every effort for unity. What I mean by theologian is a person of deep commitment to the study of God's revelation and its attendant religious truths for faith and life. In a perfect world, ecumenists would be theologians, and theologians would be ecumenists. And perhaps in that perfect world, there would not be the need for either. Yet, as Augustine of Hippo and countless others have reminded us, we do not live in a perfect world. In our situation, far too many ecumenists are not theologians. They think that the ecumenical goal is mere cooperation among divided churches, without attention to the theological issues that have separated them, and thus they ignore the scriptural imperative and indicative. And equally, far too many theologians are occupied with their pet interests. They have little or no commitment to or energy for that movement, whose task and gift is the visible unity of Christ's church. Happily, Jeffrey Wainwright cannot serve as a model for either of those two groups. Clearly, throughout his career, Jeffrey saw himself and functioned both as an ecumenist and a theologian, and perceived no conflict in those two roles. He was not alone in that perception, and others could be named today, but he is conspicuous in this regard. And this insight often leads to the question, how did Jeffrey Wainwright exercise those two roles throughout the years? One prominent way that is often identified is Jeffrey Wainwright as a member of the Faith and Order Commission of the World Council of Churches. A little of this history may be helpful here as we think about Jeffrey and Faith and Order. Faith and Order is a movement within the ecumenical movement that predates the founding of the World Council of Churches in 1948. It is a movement serving the churches by leading them into theological dialogue as a means of overcoming obstacles to and opening ways towards the manifestation of their unity given in Jesus Christ. Its origins go back to the early years of the last century. The first conference on Faith and Order took place in 1927. In 1948, it became a commission within the newly formed World Council of Churches. The commission has operated through three different means. First, world conferences. These rarely happen. For example, between the fourth and fifth conferences was a space of 40 years. Secondly, by means of commission meetings. These meet about every 3 or 4 years. And finally, meetings of the Standing Committee of the Commission, a smaller group than the Commission, and these meetings occur usually once a year. It is often stated that Jeffrey served on the Faith and Order Commission from 1976 until 1991. And this statement is undoubtedly true, and I'm not disputing it at all in what follows. But the challenge is to describe Jeffrey's activities on the commission. Let me attempt to explain this challenge. First of all, as far as I can determine, Jeffrey was never a member of the Standing Committee. I've done some research here. I cannot claim it's extensive, and if in error, I stand corrected. But this means Jeffrey related formally to Faith and Order only as the commission met every few years. Secondly, much of the documentation for this period consists in mimeographed reports of meetings on yellow or deteriorating paper, at least my copies. These reports list the participants. They say very little about the role of the individuals, except in cases where an individual person gave a lecture or presentation. This is a characteristic of Faith and Order documents, and I would argue ecumenical texts in general. I wish to highlight a profound paradox here. As I've already indicated, the ecumenical movement thrives because of commitment and mutual trust of individuals. Yet the documentation of the ecumenical movement does not reflect this fact. Almost all of these texts are anonymous, and I'll give you just 2 examples out of many possibilities. If one examines the report of the meeting of the Faith and Order Commission in Lima in 1982, which transmitted the final text of Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry, hereafter BEM, transmitted that text to the churches for their consideration, several things become transparent. First, Jeffrey was present at that meeting. Second, he is listed among the members of the Faith and Order Commission. Third, in the report of the director of the commission, Professor William H. Lazarus, the process outlining the development of BEM is described. No individual is mentioned by name. Fourth, it is only in the presentation of the BM text to the full commission that Jeffrey is indicated by name as the one making the presentation. When 1 week later, official action of the transmission of the text occurs, Jeffrey is identified with John Zazoulis, Orthodox, Jean-Marie Thiard, Roman Catholic, as a member of a special committee to decide about proposed revisions to the text. I have found no other references in the Lima text, the report of the commission. But again, my research has not been extensive. And I would point to the report of the commission in Lima as evidence of this tendency in faith and order documents not to describe the work of individuals. My second example comes from the Dictionary of the Ecumenical Movement, about which more in a moment. There is an article in the dictionary on BEM. Interestingly, it is not by Jeffrey, but Max Turian, who was a member of the staff of Faith and Order. Max drew up the first drafts of BEM and later served as the coordinator of responses from the churches to the BEM text. Jeffrey is mentioned as a member of an 8-member steering group for BEM. No chairperson is indicated, no first among equals. The members are given in alphabetical order. My point is simply this. On the basis of the official documentation of the entire faith and order process in creating BEM, it's impossible to add more specificity about Jeffrey's role. I believe that there are other areas that can be more fruitful to observe his ecumenical work, and I will turn to them briefly. And yet, before I leave faith and order, I want to turn to my theory mentioned at the outset of this presentation. Why am I here? My hunch is that I was perceived as one of those individuals who went back to Jeffrey's generation in faith and order. And like one of the last of the apostolic tradition, I'm seen as a link to the past. Now, I do believe at times that I am among a diminishing number of folks who are active in the ecumenical movement from the 1970s onward. And indeed, I could mention a great number of worthies who are no longer with us. And I thought yesterday, perhaps your theory had some credence. As I boarded the airport bus to go from the plane through immigration and so on, a young woman was sitting near the window and said, "I'll be happy to give up my seat and give it to you." So I thought, maybe you folks are onto something. But I did reply to her, "Many, many thanks, but since I've been sitting for 9 hours, I'll be quite happy to stand for the next 15 minutes. Maybe you're right. Yet my overlap with faith and order is something I want to mention now, my overlap with Jeffrey. It was not lengthy or deep. He became involved with faith and order in 1976. The time frame is noteworthy. It was a time when, by and large, a generation of giants in faith and order had left the scene or were leaving the scene. Names like George Florovsky, Douglas Horton, Paul Manier, John Meyendorff, K.E. Skisgard, and Oliver Thompson. Only some 9 or 10 years before had the Roman Catholic Church, as a result of the Second Vatican Council, officially become a member of faith and order. It was also a time when, after years of absence, the names of women began to appear in the list of participants in faith and order meetings. Jeffrey entered faith and order at a pivotal moment in the history of the faith and order movement. Jeffrey was not at Louvain in 1971, nor at the World Conference in Santiago de Compostela in 1993, for he ended his time with faith and order in 1991. Now, I became a member of the commission in the late 1970s, after Jeffrey had left the commission, and I became a member of the standing committee and continued on the standing committee until the early years of this century, which means that Jeffrey and I were together at the commission meeting in Lima and at the meeting of the commission in Stavanger in 1985. But these were large meetings involving more than 100 people. Interestingly, the 2 reports on BEM at Stavanger were not given by Jeffrey. All of which is to say, I knew Jeffrey and his ecumenical work better in other contexts. Settings that today I would argue should not overshadow his Faith and Order chapter, but point out that it was not the only arena of Jeffrey's activity as a ecumenist. One of those settings was the International Joint Commission for Dialogue between the World Methodist Council and the Roman Catholic Church, where he served as co-chair between 1986 and 2011. This was a time when the Commission published joint statements on church, apostolic tradition, revelation, teaching authority, subjects which in themselves indicate the seriousness of this dialogue's agenda. In the 1990s, Jeffrey was a member of the Forum on Bilateral Dialogues. Now, as a Lutheran, I was not personally a participant in these activities, but as a Lutheran with ecumenical interests, I followed them and became acquainted with the documentation from them. And in that documentation, you cannot miss the influence of Jeffrey Wainwright. A second example is the Dictionary of the Ecumenical Movement. The first edition was published in 1991, with a second edition in 2002. There were 6 co-editors of this work. Jeffrey was among those 6. He was not only an editor of the volume, but he contributed some 26 articles. Many of these entries, as you would expect, deal with Methodist ecumenical relations and their dialogues. Still, there are articles by Jeffrey on Christmas, Easter, federalism, universalism, and Ut Unum Sint. But as I mentioned earlier, he is not the author of the entry on BEM. Another setting was furnished by events around the development and signing of the Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification. This text was the outcome of decades of Lutheran Roman Catholic dialogue on the most neuralgic theological issue between Lutherans and Roman Catholics since and in the 16th century. In 1999, the Lutheran churches of the Lutheran World Federation and the Roman Catholic Church, on the basis of the concept of differentiating consensus, declared that no church-dividing issues on this topic exist today. While this doctrine, the doctrine of justification, did not have the same significance in Methodist Roman Catholic relations, Jeffrey saw at once the importance of this joint declaration for ecumenical relations. He played a key role in the process by which the World Methodist Council in 2006 issued a common affirmation and a statement of association with the Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification. Those Methodist dialogues disclose Methodists share a fundamental doctrinal agreement with the teaching in the Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification. Another example involves the work of Cardinal Walter Kasper, the former president of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity. As a result of Cardinal Kasper's work, a volume was published in 2009 entitled Harvesting the Fruits. This volume summarized the results of the Roman Catholics' official dialogues with Anglicans, Lutherans, Methodists, and Reformed. It also sought to furnish a map forward for ecumenism. In the process of producing this book and exploring future possibilities, a number of ecumenical colleagues were involved. After the publication in 2009, this group met in Rome to discuss the project and its potential. Jeffrey was part of that consultation process and was part of the group that met here in Rome. Last but not least in the selective catalog is Jeffrey's role as the co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Ecumenical Studies. This project was the last time I had any direct contact with Jeffrey. As we all know, he unfortunately did not live to see the publication of this volume. He died a year before its release. The volume is dedicated to him. His co-editor faithfully saw the project through to its completion. As long as he was able, Jeffrey was an active and enthusiastic participant in this project, and he wrote appropriately the chapter on faith and order. When we reflect on Jeffrey's ecumenical work, we should not overlook his writings that are not specifically ecumenical and yet deeply disclose his ecumenical commitment. An outstanding example is his work in systematic theology, doxology, the praise of God in worship, doctrine, and life. The commitment to the unity of Christ's church is apparent in its pages. There is a chapter devoted to ecumenism, and that was the constant Jeffrey Wainwright. Jeffrey Wainwright was part of an extraordinary generation. He, by example and specific contributions, from his remarkable ecumenical, liturgical, and theological abilities and commitments, left a legacy. It is a heritage that is not only fitting to honor and hold up, but to hold up to challenge still divided churches so that they may, by the aid of the triune God, ponder and overcome their continuing disunity. Thank you.